concern in Washington on the news that mourners have died in a stampede. And knowing that region well, some might even be calling them martyrs.
Obviously, US officials, this administration, will be watching events in Iran and Iraq very carefully since that deadly strike on the commander of Iran's elite Quds force. That obviously has sort of spiraled the situation in the Middle East. Much of it a situation of great uncertainty. Obviously, a lot of experts here in Washington, D.C. scrambling to try and understand what all of this means. We saw the deaths of dozens of people at Suleimani's, not his funeral, but at that procession earlier today. That obviously is something that was being managed on the ground. US officials aren't commenting on that specifically because, of course, they are more focused on what imminent threats potentially are posed now to US interests, US personnel, and to some degree allies of the United States, because the death of Soleimani has obviously put a target on many sites, interests across that region as far as experts here in the United States see it. The administration, of course, is maintaining the line that this was a strike designed to avoid and protect threats to US lives, that this was a defensive action, that by killing Soleimani, US diplomats, US military personnel were removed from an imminent threat. We haven't seen any evidence to support that yet. None of that has been made public. Democrats certainly have been asking to see the intelligence that led up to a decision that many have described as one of the most seismic in terms of US policy towards Iran and the Middle East in decades. We are expecting to hear from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo shortly. He's due to give a briefing at the State Department. We're still waiting to hear exactly what that will be on, but the good guess there is that he will be addressing some of those questions surrounding this attack and what this now means next in terms of the US strategy in the Middle East.
All right, talking about the Middle East strategy, the whole world is watching this, and the superpowers included. And I wonder, has there been comments coming from Europe, for example, from Russia, China, we know are concerned, because a lot of these global interests do converge in this complicated area, which is the Middle East.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, this is a coalition we're talking about, and certainly in Iraq, this was a coalition of forces and interests to be defeating ISIS there. And the real concern now of those allies, you mentioned France, is that the US could potentially step out of that arena, remove itself militarily from Iraq. And that, fear has been magnified certainly by the story over the last 24 hours of a letter being sent from a US general to, Iraqi forces there, saying that, the United States is going to remove its troops from Iraq. The Defense Secretary jumped on that very quickly to extinguish those concerns, saying that this letter was sent in error, that we aren't removing troops. In fact, it's more of a sort of redistribution of American forces, but it's certainly making allies nervous. If you remove the United States from Iraq, what do? Well, you potentially open the door again to a resurgence of ISIS. Remember, Iraq is meant to be a US ally, and we've just seen the Iraq parliament vote to remove all foreign forces from that country, not just the United States. So again, there's a real sense of uncertainty. Who is leading at the moment? And, are we going to open up a vacuum for more instability in the Middle East and in Iraq? And I think that's what certainly foreign allies of the United States are waiting to hear something from this administration in terms of a strategy. Where do we go next? If you believe some of the reporting, Donald Trump was offered several options in terms of how to deal with the situation, this imminent threat that we've been told existed. And he chose perhaps the most extreme, that being the drone strike, which wiped out Suleimani, the most sort of powerful, infamous commander, the second most popular person, someone who enjoyed cult status in Iran. And we're seeing the outpouring of grief and support for him, for Iran on the streets, as we saw earlier today.
All right, so we're talking about US allies in particular, but on the other side of the equation, often when it comes to the Middle East, is Russia. And there's this meeting that's taken place between Bashar al-Assad and the Russian President Vladimir Putin. Doesn't happen often, but they're meeting together now. What do we make of it? Because it's almost as if sides are squaring up.
Well, if Russia is sitting down with Bashar al-Assad, it's because it's in Russia's interests. We saw the United States sort of retreating in Syria and Russia very much moving in, and that was at the direction of Donald Trump, who basically drew a line under the fight against ISIS, saying that he had effectively wiped them out and destroyed the death cult, and that US role was over. He had promised as a president to withdraw troops from those foreign conflicts. That, of course, is a big win for Vladimir Putin, for Russia. They don't have many Middle Eastern positions strategically that they enjoy, and Syria is certainly one of them. They can now build upon that. And, you know, we know one thing about Vladimir Putin, that his actions are in his own interests, or in the interests of Russia, number one. So certainly the United States will be well aware of that meeting. They will be monitoring that meeting. But right now, this administration has a situation to deal with, and that situation is obviously what happens next after the death of Soleimani. How will Iraq respond? They have vowed what they call hard revenge. What will that look like? They certainly, according to experts here, don't want to engage all-out war with the United States. They wouldn't stand a chance in that scenario, but perhaps a more of an asymmetric retaliation, an asymmetric war, things like cyber attacks, targeting US allies, potentially disrupting those oil supplies in the Middle East. That's what the United States is now preparing for. How will Iran fulfill that promise of retaliation? What will that look like? And of course, what will Donald Trump do next? He has promised to strike 52 Iranian sites. That's what he said. Those include cultural sites. That has raised questions over whether or not these could potentially be war crimes. His own defense secretary said, we wouldn't do that, going very much against what Donald Trump has threatened. So, we're waiting to see what happens in terms of what move Iran makes next, and what a retaliation or a response from the United States will look like.
All right, Kevin McAleese, we're going to have to leave it there. Thanks very much indeed. That's our correspondent in Washington, watching the situation for us, Kevin McAleese. Well, a little bit earlier on, reporter Samkelo Maseko spoke to the